Hey, what is up guys, MurganMan4 here, and we've yet again reached the end of an era. I can't believe it's been nearly 5 years since the last one. But now, showrunner Chris Chibnall and 13th Doctor Jodie Whittaker have officially departed. But a regeneration isn't the only thing of significance here. In a way, the 60th anniversary of the show has come early, as the special was commissioned to celebrate the BBC centenary and features a multitude of kisses to the show's past, with the skill arguably unmatched by any other individual episode, perhaps even the Day of the Doctor. Now, there's a lot to talk about, so why don't we dive right into the power of the Doctor. To start with, I want to just mention that this episode is, to me, exactly what I would imagine from a blockbuster Doctor Who film, in the best way possible. It's 90 minutes long, the longest episode since the show returned, and the third longest overall. It's chock full of incredible VFX shots, we've got the ultimate villain team-up of the Big Three for the first time ever, and of course some old faces returning decades after their debut. Plus a lot of big surprises along the way. This episode just feels like Doctor Who being injected straight into your veins. It's a non-stop thrill ride that made me laugh, cry, and shout for joy. I'm not gonna lie and say it's a perfect episode, but as an experience, I've rarely felt as much as I did with these 90 minutes. And there's a lot going on to react to here. I'll be honest, much as I've enjoyed the Chibnall era, his biggest failing in my eyes is overstuffing his plots and not giving enough time to really focus in on the important stuff. But you know what? I think he pulled it off here. I didn't feel shortchanged or underwhelmed. I got exactly what I was hoping to get out of it. But because there's so much, I think it would be impractical to try and go through in story order like I normally try to do. So instead, I'm going to start with the elements that I think work the least, and build my way up to the ones I think work the best. It's not going to be in exact order, because of course a lot of it is intertwined, but it should give a general sense, and hopefully it'll make it easier for me to cover everything I want to. So with all that out of the way, let's begin. So Vinder's back in this episode after playing a major role in Flux last year. And look, here's the thing. I enjoyed Vinder well enough in Flux, but when he showed up in the trailer for this episode, I really wasn't sure what he was going to contribute. And it turns out, not much, unfortunately. I really do think Vinder is the only aspect of the story that flat out fails. The only thing he does is persuade the Master to return to his conversion chamber thingy. Other than that, he's just kinda there, standing around in the background. And unlike Kate's appearance in Flux, Vinder isn't already in the area, so to speak, so the story has to go out of its way to get him involved. So it just feels really jarring every time we cut away to him. On my rewatch of the episode, I kept getting the urge to just skip over his part so I could get back to the other stuff. On a more positive note, his role is small enough that it doesn't really have a negative impact on the episode as a whole, but that also emphasizes how pointless it was to include him in the first place. So, yeah, the only outright negative thing I have to say about this episode. Sort of linked to Vinder is the Quorungs that he, and separately the Doctor, are searching for, and the cyber planet it's been trapped on. Now, unlike Vinder, while this doesn't get a lot of screen time, it does serve an important purpose. The cyber planet being necessary for both the Master's plans and the Doctor's resolution, and the Quorungs acting as a way to get the Doctor involved in the plot, as well as being a power source for the cyber planet. Unfortunately, that's about as far as it goes. Both interesting concepts, but ultimately only there as plot devices. Not bad, but more of a shrug. So, the Daleks. I get why they're here. This is a big celebration of the show, so it's a great opportunity to have all three of the Doctor's biggest nemeses working together, amazingly, for the first time. And it works in the context of the story. But the Daleks definitely get the short end of the stick here. To be honest, they're little more than window dressing, and I'm not sure the story would have to change all that much, if at all really, if you just replace their role with more Cybermen. I'm of the mind that Chris Chibnall is one of the best writers of the Daleks we've ever had, but this is probably their weakest appearance under his watch. Even then though, he still tries to inject a really interesting concept in there, in the form of a Dalek which has decided the Daleks have strayed too far from the original purpose in perpetuating the survival of the Kaled race. But unfortunately, the story simply has no time to explore this angle, and the fact that the Dalek is being genuine ultimately makes no difference. So I'm not upset that they're here, But the story definitely didn't need them, and when I think of this story, the Daleks are one of the last things that come to mind. Of course, Jodie Whittaker and Chris Chibnall aren't the only ones departing with this episode. This story also acts as the final appearances of Mandeep Gill as Yaz, and John Bishop as Dan. And both of these exits end up being a little untraditional. First up, we've got Dan, and I actually really like the simplicity of it. Dan has a near-death experience near the beginning of the episode, and it acts as a kind of wake-up call to him that he's not going to stay lucky forever, and he's got a life to get back to. An imperfect life, sure, but one he doesn't want to lose. Unfortunately, the context of the exit puts it at a disadvantage. For one thing, we've got a whole massive episode to get to, so we can't exactly linger. Despite being his last story, it's very easy to forget Dan was ever in this, right up until his cameo at the end. Speaking of which, it feels very jarring to have a companion leave so close to the beginning of the episode. I respect Chibnall getting him out of the way to focus on the more important stuff. As I said, that's something he's often struggled with in the past, so the story as a whole certainly benefits from this. But it does make you wonder if perhaps it would have been better if Dan's exit had been a part of the previous story, or indeed, why Dan was even introduced at all. Much as I've enjoyed him, I really do think that Flux in the recent specials would have worked better had it just been the Doctor and Yaz. And then there's Yaz. To be honest, I think this might be my least favorite companion exit in the new series. I get what Chibnall's going for, that Yaz and the Doctor decide it's better to part company on their own terms, and saving Yaz the pain of seeing the woman she fell in love with completely change, but I don't really feel like it's executed in a way that makes this particularly clear. On the surface, it just feels like she and the Doctor part company because they know her contract's up, so it just ends up feeling contrived rather than a natural progression of character. It has some nice moments, it just doesn't work as a whole, unfortunately. The power of the Doctor marks a few notable returns, amongst them being Unit, seen in full force for the first time since Series 9, though we did pay a visit down the organization's time stream during Flux. And of course, Kate Stewart is back to lead them, and thankfully much better utilized than the last time. It's established here, though not all that explicitly, that Kate has been rebuilding Unit since his temporary shutdown, though I have to admit it makes said shutdown rather jarring in retrospect, as aside from a couple throwaway lines about their new HQ, they may as well be at full operation. Though given what we saw in Flux, I'd be willing to bet that Chibnall had a bigger story plan that COVID ended up scrapping. Either way, it is good to see them again, and it's a great excuse to get some classic companions involved in the story. And as for Kate, the story puts her to good use against the cyber infiltration of Unit, including what I think is possibly Gemma Redgrave's best performance in the role. And speaking of, the Cybermen are back. And fittingly, not just any Cybermen, the Cybermasters. I'm really glad to see them come back, and with a fantastic revamped design. I think they're an incredible concept, and they're used to really great effect here, serving as a great intro to the story, and of course the regenerative abilities being key to the story's resolution. However, they're not the only Cybermen around. There's also a group of regular Cybermen, led by a clone Deshad, causing havoc at Unit. Their infiltration via a tissue-compressed Russian doll, given to Tegan by the Master, pretending to be the Doctor, is really well done, and I feel like this story continues to emphasize the relentless, unstoppable nature of the Cybermen that the Chibnall era has excelled with. Now, the only question is, why is it Deshad and a bunch of regular Cybermen instead of Cybermasters? I do actually think the latter would have been more fitting for the story, especially as the explanation for Deshad's presence admittedly feels a little contrived. But to be honest, I can't really complain too much, because Deshad is such an excellent villain, and even though it doesn't need to be him, he is admittedly a lot more fun to watch than other Cybermen. And of course, he also got this incredible sequence, which I feel wouldn't have had the same effect without him. So overall, while the Cybermen aren't the focus of the story, I think they're ultimately really well served here, and I love watching them in every scene they're in. And come on, Sagan's Cybermen theme is just incredible. Here we are, the mastermind behind it all. I've made it no secret that I absolutely love Sacha Dhawan's take on the Master, and that holds just as true here as it ever has. And man, do we get to see a lot of different sides to him here. I think that's one of the reasons I love him so much. He's got the whole range. He can do the calm menace of Delgado. His first appearance in this episode is arguably the most Delgado scene since Delgado, all the way to the banana silliness of Gomez. I really like that it's impossible to be comfortable with this incarnation, as he's constantly donning different identities, and you never know how he's going to react to things. And on top of all that, this is an incarnation that absolutely despises himself. He's got nothing left to lose, because he genuinely doesn't care if he goes down in the process. It's such a fascinating angle, and I think it makes him the most unpredictable incarnation of the Master, and by extension, possibly the most dangerous. So, what exactly is it that he gets up to in this episode? Well, quite a bit. So I think I'll break it down by the identities he takes on throughout the story. When the Doctor first encounters him, he's in the guise of a seismologist, and I think this one is my favorite of the episode. It's a great look, and it's an opportunity for the Master to be a bit calmer, have a bit more fun, though of course his more manic side still bubbles through at times. I love the threat he delivers the Doctor because he's absolutely right. It basically locks her into being exactly where he wants him. It's also a great moment when the Doctor later orders Yaz to cover him with a gun. The Master is never good news, but this puts it on a whole other level, emphasized by the almost bewildered expression the Master gives. From there, he's taken to Unit, and what follows is probably one of my favorite ever Master scenes. I love his nonchalance about being thrown in a cell, because he knows no cell can hold him, his jabs at Kate, Tegan, and Ace, his mock sadness at the Doctor leaving them all alone, and of course the wonderful line, "You'll all feel safer then with me in the building." Fantastically performed, and a great summation of the Master's danger and malice. Now, of course, he does eventually escape from Unit, causing a lot of havoc along the way, and then goes back in time in the guise of Rasputin. Now, the story never actually gives a reason for this, and it's a shame more couldn't have been done with the concept, because from what I know of the real Rasputin, him being the Master in disguise is actually pretty fitting. But, that being said, I don't think that the story really needed to justify it. It's a fun disguise and a fun setting, and that's the most important thing in my mind. And of course, but I digress. It's here where the big three finally come together, though while it's an exciting moment, it doesn't receive as much emphasis as it probably should. I don't even think the Daleks or Cybermen get a single line of dialogue here. But I do really like how this is used to foreshadow what's to come, with the Master drawing comparisons to the Doctor's own ideology. What unites us is stronger than what divides us, even going so far as to mockingly refer to them as his own fam. And it's here where his ultimate goal is revealed. He's going to force the Doctor to regenerate. And not just any regeneration. He's going to force her to regenerate into him. I'm not entirely sure how the logistics of it work, but I'm willing to assume he had some consciousness-swapping technology on him to put his own mind into the Doctor's, and as far as the Master's schemes go, wow, this is a mad one, and a lot of fun. And I think it's a fantastic way of emphasizing the running theme of this Master, that he hates himself and is jealous of the Doctor, so in the end, he becomes her. So it might seem counterintuitive that he just continues to do mastery things after becoming the Doctor, that his end goal is to tarnish the name of the Doctor forever, but I don't think it is. It goes without saying that the Master is broken and far from rational, and I think he can't bring himself to be anything other than evil. It's the only thing that gives him joy, however temporary, and a sense of purpose. He's too addicted to it to escape. So if he can't get better, like he tried and in his mind failed to do with Missy, then the only other option is to make the Doctor worse. So by becoming the Doctor and doing all those mastery things, in his mind, that's no longer his own doing, but the Doctor's. It's a messed up perspective for sure, but it's stuff like this that makes me endlessly fascinated with this incarnation. There's so much to explore in what makes him tick. And what haunting final lines before his plan is reversed, with that music swelling behind him. Don't let me go back to being me. This is definitely the most tragic incarnation of the Master, and I'm really going to miss him a great deal. Oh, and that mishmash of the Doctor's outfits? Incredible. It happened. At long last, it happened. Classic Doctors in the modern show properly. Okay, yes, we had Tom Baker in the 50th, but this episode adds 4 more to that roster and proves without a shadow of a doubt that it doesn't matter one jot that any of them are decades older now. And same goes for the returning companions, for that matter. The Guardians of the Edge, where one incarnation goes to join their past incarnations upon regenerating, is such a great concept and a fantastic excuse to use the other Doctors without necessarily having them play their original incarnations, but still be playing the Doctor. We even get some of that classic multi-Doctor bickering. It's a genius magical moment that just left me grinning ear to ear. But that's not all. Shortly afterwards, the story introduces personal holograms of the Doctor for each companion to use. And it's essentially the same trick Chibnall played in The Vanquishers, being able to have the Doctor be in multiple places at once, but I think this is a bit easier to digest than the Doctor being literally split apart. And of course it allows for 2 standout moments that really could only happen in Doctor Who, giving closure to 2 characters from decades ago. It's absolutely beautiful seeing Tegan and Ace reunited on screen with their Doctors, and finally receiving the words they've always wanted to hear. Wonderfully written and beautifully played. These aren't just standout scenes in the episode, but the show as a whole. Unforgettable. And lastly-ish, we'll get to that, we've got one more returning Doctor. Jo Martin's fugitive Doctor. Despite just being a hologram, it's still great to see her, and while it wasn't particularly necessary, and it is kind of awkward that out of the 4 episodes she appears in, only once was it actually her, it would have felt even stranger if she hadn't popped up at some point, and this was a simple way to integrate her into the story without derailing an already packed episode. It's a real shame more wasn't done with her, but even in her brief appearances, Jo Martin totally steals the show. I just can't stop smiling. There's just something so magical about new series Doctors meeting classic companions, and this is no exception. I've admittedly never been the biggest fan of Tegan, but I think she works really well here. And then of course we have Ace, one of my all-time favorite companions. Janet Fielding and Sophie Aldred slip effortlessly back into their roles, and I think Tegan and Ace bounce off each other really well, and their differing reactions to seeing the Doctor again makes for a great contrast. One of the things I was most concerned about here was, with so much going on, that one or both of these companions wouldn't get the time to shine that they deserved. But thankfully, they both get plenty to do, and of course, as mentioned, finally receive the emotional closure we never got on screen. And seeing Ace in her classic getup again, wielding a baseball bat, I've got to be honest, it's hard for me to see these characters as anything other than the young women they were when they first joined the TARDIS. They just come back into those roles so easily. Which is why it felt a little weird when Graham first popped up and Ace started flirting with him. It took me a moment to register that the actors are actually pretty close in age. But I have to say, I did actually think that was a really fun dynamic for what little time we got of it. And it was great to see Graham again, too. He's my favorite companion of the Chibnall era, and Bradley Walsh is just hilarious. But that's not all. It culminates with one of the greatest scenes in the history of the show, stretching all the way back to the very beginning and summing up exactly what makes this show so special. The Doctor's previous companions getting together to share their stories is such a genius idea, and it's crazy that it's taken nearly 60 years for it to happen. And even though it's short, how wonderful is it to see Bonnie Langford, Katie Manning, and William Russell back in the show? I'm not ashamed to admit that it made me a bit teary-eyed, especially the way it transitions us into the regeneration. This is a payoff 60 years in the making, and worth every step to reach it. And here we are at last, the end of the road. The regeneration is always a very special moment, but if I'm being perfectly honest, I've been kind of underwhelmed with the last few, especially with a couple of repeated tropes, namely big, long goodbye speeches, lots of sadness and dourness, and the regeneration causing the TARDIS to immediately crash, if not explode. I was dreading another of these samey regenerations for a long time, so it's hard to describe my joy when we finally got what I've waited so long to see again. A short but sweet, optimistic regeneration outside the TARDIS! Here, Chris Chibnall achieved something I never anticipated, particularly from him. For the longest time, my favorite regeneration was the Ninth Doctor's, and that's no longer the case. I just love everything about this one. The way it begins interspersed with the companions talking about their love for her, the joyful anticipation of what the future holds, and what a beautiful setting for it to happen in, with the regeneration effects taken to absolute perfection and a glorious rendition of 13's theme. Absolutely beautiful. It's everything I've ever wanted from a regeneration, and I couldn't be happier. But we're not quite done yet, because who else pops up but David Tennant? Now, admittedly, this didn't come as a surprise to me, based off of what we saw filming earlier this year, and I have to say I'm not a huge fan of the concept of the previous Doctor coming back to be the incumbent. But I'm willing to see what RTD does with it, and it's certainly fun and nostalgic having the classic What cliffhanger. I mean, that was a given. But I have to admit, there is a bit of a disconnect between 13's last words and an old face popping up. It certainly would have fit better thematically had Ncuti shown up instead. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. It's interesting, to say the least. And that was The Power of the Doctor. A lot to say, and to be honest, I could have said more, but I didn't find a fitting spot in my review for everything. But on the whole, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Is it flawless? No, but man, if that isn't one of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had as a Doctor Who fan. And what a fitting title, too. I was really worried it would end up being some boring generic thing like regeneration, but I'm really pleased with how well it fits with the show's themes. The power of the Doctor is friendship. The power of the Doctor is love. I love it. I love it. An incredible celebration of the show, and to be perfectly honest, if RTD wasn't coming back, don't get me wrong, I'm glad he is, but if he wasn't, I would have been more than satisfied had this not only been the 60th anniversary special, but a temporary end to the show. It just makes me smile. And before I go, I'd just like to quickly put this episode into a couple of rankings. Overall, it's my second favorite 13th Doctor episode, just behind The Haunting of Villa Diodati. And in terms of regeneration stories, I currently have it fourth behind The War Games, Parting of the Ways, and The Caves of Androzani, or sixth if we include expanded media. I do feel like the last few regeneration stories, while they certainly haven't been bad, have been lacking, and I'm ecstatic to see that trend broken. But, what did you think of the power of the Doctor? Please let me know in the comments below. And with that, Morgan Man 4, over and out. I'll see you guys later.